We're now going to go beyond the basic model that we've had so far in the course about how prices are set. So in the models that we've seen before, either the firm charges just a single price, or it sets different prices for different people, carrying out various forms of price discrimination. But those prices that we've considered, with the exception of the idea of randomized pricing, are essentially fixed prices. They're fixed for a considerable period of time. We can now look at different ways of setting prices. We'll look at dynamic pricing, where prices are changed quite frequently. We'll look at the idea of markup pricing, that is, basing price on cost in some fashion. And we'll briefly just look at the idea of price discovery, where both buyers and sellers get together to determine the price. So let's start with dynamic pricing. So what we mean by dynamic pricing is that the prices that are set are frequently changed, hence the word dynamic. And it's possible that we could include some forms of price discrimination here as well, as prices are being changed. Now, clearly this is only going to be possible if it's not too costly to change prices from moment to moment. Traditionally, retailers used to put price tags on things, and it was costly to put new prices on those things. Economists call the cost of price changing menu costs, referring to the idea that if a restaurant wants to change its menu, it's going to have to throw away the old ones and print new ones. There are particularly low costs to changing prices in e-commerce when things are being sold over the internet. And as we've seen earlier when we considered the idea of yield maximization, changing prices frequently is often a very desirable policy to undertake if the goods and services that the firm is selling are perishable. So in other words, they're worthless past a certain date. And as I mentioned, dynamic pricing can be used to carry out price discrimination as well as randomized pricing. Well, I'm just going to give you an example of dynamic pricing on the internet. And of course, the first thing that one would think of is Amazon and its prices. In Canada, as well as in the United States, there's a website called camelcamelcamel.com. In Canada, it has a CA in front of it. And what this website claims that it does is it tracks the prices that Amazon sets for particular products and compares them to what it calls a third-party price. So it's not clear who that third party is, but presumably another seller. And you can get charts like this that describe how Amazon's price has changed over time. So the example that I'm showing here is something that I was thinking of buying myself. It's just an external hard drive that I was thinking might be useful just as a backup for all the data on my computer. So I was keeping an eye on this particular product. Now, if we can believe the data that's shown here, when this product was initially introduced, it was at a fairly high price. So that kind of conforms to the idea of price skimming that we saw. But you can see it was not a uniformly high price. It kind of bounced up and down. Perhaps what was going on was that Amazon was experimenting to see what the demand curve looked like by testing various price points. So here the price is fluctuating between about $140 and $150. And then there's a sudden price drop to less than $100, but you can see that there's a lot of variation, including some upward spikes. And recently, the product has been selling for a price considerably higher than has been the case over the past year or so. One thing that you can do at this camel.com is ask it to send you an email if the price falls below a particular level. So this is an example of dynamic pricing. Why is Amazon doing this? Well, perhaps again, the up and down movements here are sampling buyers' responses to different prices. Remember that Amazon also has a lot of information about you. It knows everything about your previous visits to its website. It may have some sense of how price sensitive you are or how price insensitive. It claims that it does not offer individualized prices, that is, different prices at the same time to different people, but nevertheless, it could be trying to take advantage of the information that it has about you. Here's a possible example. It has been alleged that people who are members of Amazon Prime who get what is called free shipping as one of the benefits of their Prime membership, that is an annual payment that they have to make every year. It's been alleged in a lawsuit that seems to be still ongoing. I haven't been able to find out how it's ended. But the allegation, anyway, is that what Amazon has done is it's simply raised the prices of the products that it's offering to Prime members to, in effect, charge them for the shipping, but to pretend that the shipping is free. Why might it do that? Well, it knows that people who are Prime members are probably less likely to go shopping elsewhere and to do comparison pricing. Maybe they're more price insensitive, so they can get away with charging a higher base price and letting people think that they're getting free shipping. I would just suggest you have a look at this article if you would like an entertaining read on both the history of pricing itself, but also some details of dynamic pricing on the internet. If you just do a search for the title of this article, it's freely available on the website of the Atlantic magazine. The next topic that I'm just going to very briefly say something about is the idea of setting prices based on costs. So this is often called markup pricing. That is, you take costs in some form and you mark them up by a certain percentage to determine what the price is going to be. Now the text that we're using doesn't really go into this in any detail. It just makes an assertion that the profit maximizing price, and therefore the optimal markup over costs, is going to depend on the elasticity of demand. So in other words, it's going to depend on how price sensitive customers are. Now that makes sense, because you would think that the more price sensitive customers are, the closer we will have to keep our prices to costs. In other words, the more competitively we're going to have to price our product. The flip side, if customers are less price sensitive, then we can raise prices above costs by a greater amount. We would choose a greater markup. Now the text doesn't go into the details of just how you do this, but I thought I would just show you this. You can prove mathematically that the profit maximizing price is related to the price elasticity of demand, which is E, and the firm's marginal costs of producing its product. I'm not expecting you to be able to derive this or even to memorize it. I just want to give you an example. So this term here in the square brackets is the optimal markup, and the costs that we're going to consider are marginal costs. So we're going to multiply marginal costs by some factor, which clearly depends on the price elasticity of demand, to determine the profit maximizing price. The nice thing about this is that the firm doesn't need a lot of information. It simply needs to have an idea of what its marginal costs are, which should not be that difficult, and perhaps a little bit more difficult, it needs to know the price elasticity of demand. At least it needs to have an estimate of it. It does not need to know what the entire demand curve looks like. In this case, I should just add the price elasticity of demand is defined as a negative number. So we're not taking its absolute value. Well, we could just do a couple of exercises just to see how the optimal markup varies depending on the price elasticity of demand. So I've just considered two values of the elasticity, one where it's equal to 10, so demand is very price elastic. So remember, the elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So this is just saying if we increase our price by 1%, the quantity demanded will fall by 10%. In comparison, an elasticity of minus 1.2 is relatively not very elastic. It's not inelastic because it's not less than 1 in absolute value, but it's pretty low. If you just plug these values into this equation and you just assume a marginal cost of some particular amount, you can figure out what your profit maximizing price would be. So I'm just going to show you the solutions here. So if demand is very price elastic, in the minus 10 case, then you can calculate that our markup is just 11%. So in other words, we would take marginal cost, multiply it by 1.11, and that would give us our profit maximizing price. Quite close to marginal cost. On the other hand, if demand is not very elastic, then the markup can be much greater. What we would do is, in this case, if you work it out, it turns out that the optimal markup is 6, which in other words is 500%. So we would charge a price of 6 times $50 or $300. So a big difference in terms of what the profit maximizing price would be. Well, finally, I want to say a word about the idea of price discovery. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, this involves buyers and sellers getting together to determine the price. And surely, as I write here, this is the oldest form of determining prices. People would meet and negotiate what was going to be exchanged for what. So if we're having negotiating and bargaining determining price, what's the price going to be? Turns out that economics can't really predict the outcome. The best it can do is perhaps say something in general terms about the highest or the lowest possible prices that might come out of the situation. So if we're considering a negotiating situation or a situation of bargaining, obviously the outcome is going to depend on relative bargaining power. Bargaining power is going to depend on what the alternative is to not reaching a bargain. So that's going to influence what the individual parties are willing to accept. And of course, bargaining skills is going to come into the picture as well. There are lots of examples of this kind of price determination. If you think of labor negotiations, for example, between unions and employers, that's kind of a classic example. The potential problems with this kind of price setting are that it's time-consuming and expensive. Obviously, labor negotiations over wages may take a long time, and it's possible that agreement might not be reached. So if agreement isn't reached and negotiations break down, in the case of disputes over wages, you end up with a costly strike and so on. So you can end up with situations in which the two parties can't reach an agreement, even though in principle one did exist in which both of them could have been better off. Well, let's turn now to our last topic of price setting, which is auctions. And of course, that's going to be a situation in which the buyers alone determine what the price is going to be.